What you're here to see, and what I'm actually really excited about this event. It's two people I admire and have admired for years for their work on spaces of conflict, military technology, and then the city, the impact of war on a global level on landscapes from both cities themselves to rural areas, and then also just sort of conflict regions and more generally speaking, regions that don't appear to be in conflict at all, but maybe are being bought out by agribusiness firms or are slowly being undergoing a kind of undeclared demographic transition, similar to what's happening in Tibet under the Chinese. We're going to do two back-to-back interviews. The first interview is with Simon Norfolk, a photographer who hopefully many of you will know his work. He's done work for the New York Times and for different news organizations all over the world studying conflict zones, but also has a whole series of really fantastic books, including a new project called Burke Norfolk, Photographs from the War in Afghanistan, which we're going to spend a lot of time talking about tonight. And then Noah Shachtman, who I'll introduce when it comes time to speak to him. The structure of the thing is that we're going to do a live kind of interview with Simon. When that's over, we'll do a live interview with Noah. When that's over, we'll then have the two of them up here and just kind of throw it open to a discussion. So if you have burning questions, if you can save them to that final segment, which will be about an hour, then that will be best. I think that there are things that will come out in each presentation that are going to resonate off of one another in a really interesting way. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing the two of these guys in dialogue as well. So with that, thanks for being here as well. And
could you do me a favour? Could you just come a bit closer? I can't shut it. Come in because I've been talking all day. There's no more words left in the unit.
Yeah, there's a lot of chairs up here. So
thank you. You're not scared.
I should add that there's going to be a video loop during the presentations of Simon's photographs here on the wall. And these are both older projects as well as a lot of images taken from Burke Norfolk. So these are just kind of a nice background for the conversation in general. So Simon, obviously you and I have spoken before. We've done an interview for Building Blog and an edited version of that for the Building Blog book. But I'd really like to catch up by talking about what you're working on now. Obviously the Burke Norfolk is a new project. It's been at the Tate, just opened in Los Angeles, if I'm not mistaken, and of course you're here in New York, both for Burke Norfolk and to give a lecture tomorrow night at the SVA. I'd just love to know more about that project. How did it come about? Who is John Burke? What were you aiming to do by taking on his legacy, and how did you do that?
Well, who is he first? I mean, first of all, I'd say he's the greatest war photographer that you've never heard of. A really brilliant photographer. And I wanted to go back to Afghanistan ever since 2001. I'm a big believer in, when it comes to other people's miseries, that you shouldn't be a kind of tourist. That, you should go if you've got something to say and do, and not go if you haven't. And I couldn't find a kind of formula, a kind of passageway into talking about people, other than something that was rather vainglorious. That would be, in 2001 I photographed it, it was a bomb crater. In 2011 it's a pizza hut, which is not only rather trite, but also a very false idea of what has happened in terms of development in that town. There are some things that have got a little better. There's a lot of things that have got a lot worse, and there's some stuff that's got downright weird. And then it was only when I saw the Burke photographs. John Burke is, as far as I can make out, there's only 14 albums of his work in the world. There's only 2 in the US. There's one in the Library of Congress, and there's one in the Getty. Queen's got a couple, British Library's got a couple. And the National Media Museum, which is where I first saw one of these albums. And these are albums of the original photographs stuck into albums that were produced in 1879, 1880, during the Second Anglo-Afghan War. These are the first ever pictures that were taken in Afghanistan. Beautiful and extraordinary there as well. And it was when I saw that I thought, now there's a chance to talk about, rather than just a thing about me, what I saw in 2001, something about the kind of cycles of empire, which is something I lived in. With this idea of just empire rising and falling and just coming around again and repeating itself, because so many of the things that Burke is photographing, the lies about intelligence, the lies about how well we be received by the Afghans, the lies about how popular the Federal Army are, the lies about how easy it would be to resupply the British Army, 30 years before. It's all the same kind of stuff that just rotates around and around. It was true in 1880, it's true now. So a sort of attempt to vaguely re-photographic the things that he was doing was what kind of laid the Burke Norfolk project as a way of trying to. A lot of it is about trying to answer some of the problems with photojournalism as well, the superficiality of it, the lack of its ability to talk about any kind of process or depth, something that's trying to kind of punch through its surfaceness, and something which is trying to be a response to just how bloody awful I think most of the photography that's come out of the war in Afghanistan is. I think it's a real garbage, every piece of it. And I think part of its relentless pro-war, pro-patriotic, pro-our boys, even our weak, fractured angel boys, is the reason why there's no real popular resistance there. So that was where the project started. What was the rest of the question?
Okay, I think that actually covers a great deal. Well, I'm curious then too in that regard that so many of your photos, even some of the ones that we see, maybe this is not the best example, but even it's an empty tennis court. Not this, but we saw one earlier where it's a tennis court with a guard tower overlooking it. And there's something unbelievably both evocative and also provocative about photographs of that nature that actually don't show conflict. They don't show ruin. They don't show. As you say, our soldiers throwing grenades at the enemy or taking sniper fire or, up in the hills dodging explosions. And I guess I'm curious about how you managed to treat the, and is this a holdover from, or not a holdover, but a reflection of your engagement with Burke's work in the sense that you're almost documenting the slow, almost ponderous chess game-like organization by which the occupation is, it's a series of chairs in the middle of the desert with people standing there. It's a series of trucks parked in a parking lot. But there doesn't seem to be conflict as such. It's just sort of this very staid, almost landscape, arranged landscape.
I mean, possibly, maybe I'm not that interested in conflict because conflict is just kind of product. It's product of the thing. I'm interested in imperialism and those processes which bring conflict into being and those things that drive things along, which is why a sort of wishy-washy or geo-wishy war sort of political response to war is not sufficient in my book. And it needs to be a practiced anti-imperialist response to it. So I think I'm interested in what kind of drives those things. So for me, a soldier getting wounded or a bomb getting is not that interesting. I'm interested in war as a kind of a machinery, as a process, something which drives along capitalism itself. Certainly in this country, where great volume of industrial production is something that is. This military-industrial complex which is winding around through Congress and back out into producing more military production. To the point where, we're almost fighting war in order to use up the stuff that we've already made to fight a war, and then we can fight another war afterwards. Certainly, Noah's stuff is much more about not even the war that they're fighting now, which is a sort of dusted, really, but kind of making preparations for the war in 20 years' time, because that's the technologies that we need to start thinking about. So that idea of this sort of unstoppable machine that's almost, certainly in the south, in Helmand now, to just about everything that comes into the military bases. Ammo and people comes by aeroplane, but everything else comes on the jingle trucks up from Pakistan, from Karachi into the south. And it costs something like $8,000 in protection fees to move each one of those trucks. And something like 30% of that money is now being given to the Taliban in order to not shoot on those trucks. So you now got to put that, and that now is the largest source of income for the Taliban. They were never that involved in the drug trade. So you now got this bizarre situation, like in Catch-22, where the Americans are actually paying for both sides of the war. This is extraordinary circumstances. And the amount of money that has been sunk into Afghanistan, if you look at their website, Cost of War, it's pushing up towards $1 trillion. And that doesn't include a whole lot of stuff like how you're going to have to look after all these one-legged soldiers for the rest of their lives. So $1 trillion, and you put that in some kind of context. The space shuttle program, $320 billion. The Greek government is looking for $65 billion. You can get Greece for $65 billion if you want the Greece. It's very nice, the beaches are. So this is $1 trillion, and that kind of money, if you throw that money at anywhere, you throw it at Greece, you have an impact. But if you threw it at sort of pretty much leveled third world countries that emerged from the war with the Soviets and the war with the Taliban in 2001, it makes a massive impact on the place. It really does change the place drastically, but the way it's changed that city is twisted and warped and bizarre and untenable.
Well, I'm really curious about how it has changed the city. I mean, I think it's really interesting that every war, every military intervention has spatial effects, and in this case, it's this massive runaway investment, the $1 trillion, that is having spatial effects.
Yeah.
It isn't necessarily producing, we were talking about the new Sheraton Hotel that's coming into the city and so on. It's not necessarily producing signature buildings that represent the sort of renewal of the Afghan society.
There's a signature building which they're shooting into the American embassy from right now as we speak. There's a large complex attack taking place in Kabul today, all day, and the staff of the American embassy have barricaded themselves in their dining room. The city has changed in the most extraordinary way, and the book is presented as a tale of two very bizarre cities. The first is the city of Kabul, which is this weird, twisted thing, and the second is the mega cities of the military bases in the south. But the city of Kabul has been the most extraordinary economy I've ever seen. It's almost, and I see economies as being kind of after Altazan, that they have this kind of layers. But at the very top level of society, that level of society where there is a monopoly on the state's use of violence, an unbelievable amount of money is being thrown at producing a security state which the Americans can leave before the next election. So in order to be able to leave and walk away before the next election, they are spending no end of money on helicopter bases, barracks, police stations, torture centres, prison systems, drug introduction, intelligence agencies. Unbelievable. Barrack buildings like I've never seen, certainly better than the stuff you see in the UK. At the level of the security state, incredibly well upholstered. And then below that, in what we would call the regular economy of like schools and jobs and bridges and that, nothing whatsoever is happening. No money is being spent by the foreigners because it's too insecure to go into the countryside and build a school. And no money is being spent by Afghans or returnee Afghans, because why would you build a factory in Kabul when in 6 months' time, 18 months' time, the Taliban is back in control? So there's a gaping vacuum in the centre of the economy. At the bottom of the economy is a whole load of money swishing around, and this is embezzled money that's all been dropped out of the bottom of contract. Congress were talking about, they think 32 billion has gone straight. Last year they stopped looking for 5 billion because it was too hard to go bother looking for it. And this money has all been stolen by contractors and investors in Afghanistan. And that money, which doesn't get invested into this recent Dubai property blip, which is now burst, or that money which did go to the Kabul Bank, which disappeared with $1 billion worth of savings in it, is being invested in this huge outgrowth of private palaces, poppy palaces, Pakistani palaces, kind of very vulgar architecture of columns and pillars and winged horses on the roof. And there are whole districts of the city now which are luxury buildings, luxury private palaces. And if you can surround them with a glass wall and a generator and some guards, then you can rent those out to NGOs for $30,000 a month, if they're in like part-time, as accommodation for embassy staff, internationals. And so that's an entire economy of its own in the city. And it's even getting blended in with narcotics money. The term that people use to describe this is narco-section. And whole districts of the city are just walled compounds, militarized compounds of these private palaces that stretch for miles in some places. So the economy itself has this unbelievably bizarre, hollow, donut-like shape, where the center of it, that middle part, is completely absent, and the periphery, this top and this bottom, are incredibly feather-bedded, and all of it can only exist with massive injections, massive re-injections of cash. And the day the troops leave is the day the money stops, the day the NGOs leave, the day the troops leave, the security stops, and when they leave, the whole damn thing will come crashing. So it's an unbelievably fluffed up kind of economy that is just kind of conjured out of thin air. And shall I talk about the cities in the south? Well, the other cities that I was interested in were the mega bases in the south, places like Kandahar Airfield, and there's two kind of conjoined twins, which is called Camp Bastion and Camp Leatherneck. Camp Bastion is the British one, and Leatherneck is the US Marines. And these are the equivalent of small cities. Camp Leatherneck is something like 45,000 people, 42,000 people. And that's not 42,000 people plus women, kids and old people, is it? It's 42 fighting people of, between this age and this age. 24-hour a day, massive airstrips. So Kandahar Airfield, Camp Bastion, which is controlled by the British, the airfield, is actually the third biggest British airport in the world now. It's London Heathrow, London Gatwick, and Camp Bastion. And these places are colossal sites with their own sewage farms and their own waste disposal, with their own police, and they even have a little cell for putting miscreants in. They're like little kind of cities. And again, places that are completely fluffed up, and a massive injection of cash at the bottom of them to keep these things, because they're utterly untenable, completely out of sync with any of their surroundings, plonks down in the middle of nowhere. In fact, Canvasting was chosen because it is in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and therefore no one could find it to shoot at it. Canberra Airfield is a different thing. It's on a former civilian airfield, so it's much more vulnerable. But these unbelievable kind of mega cities, 24 hours a day, most of the action happens at night, continual movements of helicopters, the continual ingress of logistical supplies, and then they're repackaging onto convoys that go out to the FOBs, the forward operating bases. So these unbelievably busy places that are just this massive swirling and swishing of colossal amounts of treasure, military treasure. And when you look at these pictures of John Burke, of these British soldiers, you know, he's got an overcoat, a billy cap, that's him, he's in Afghanistan, off you go, that's what it needs. Whereas when you see a modern, technologized army, you understand this massive train of material that has to follow behind this thing. The logistics guy told me that he thinks he stores something like 1 million different objects, which is what a modern technologized army needs to keep on the road. And a $100 million airplane can sit on the tarmac for one of the 3 Russians. So that huge logistic train is where all of the tax dollars are being spent. But it's also the chief vulnerability of a modern technologized army about how you get enough fuel into the planes, about how you can get enough packets of yogurt into the planes.
There's a whole series of things I'd love to know about, but one is just simply the sort of politics of access to these spaces and whether or not, we've talked about your access to countryside bases, not getting fired at, pretending, or just appearing to be the kind of doofus traveling photographer, which is a sort of a deliberate act. But I'm curious about when you show up at Camp Bastion, at a forward operating base, what exactly is the logistics of being able to go in and take photographs? Are they curious about what you're photographing, and are there certain things that you're encouraged to photograph?
And bamboozled by what I'm photographing as well, because all the time they know that they love the embed system. It really works. It's just the best thing they ever thought of in terms of neutralizing any kind of dissenting photographers and journalists, and completely turning into pussycats. And also this idea that they are the gatekeepers. So everyone goes, tempers what they're going to say because they want to come back another time in the future because they're convinced about it. And I said from the day I go, this is one shot. You can only go and assume you will never be able to go back. Otherwise, you will moderate and modify what you're going to say. So they know that you're going to be careful because you might want to go back in the future. Yes, with you. You have to sign a document with the British. It's a thing called the Green Book. It's about 40 pages about what you want to do. It's a similar one. I was asked to produce a very detailed list of what I want to photograph, which is quite difficult because they won't tell you what they've got. But you have to kind of guess stuff and try and pull it out of the news reports. And go, oh, I see you've got a place where you clean tanks. Can I photograph your tank cleaning device? And then they say, okay, you can photograph that. So I had to have a very sort of strict list. I had to be security cleared, and I only managed to get away with that because I had an assignment from the New York Times magazine who didn't really use the word, but that was this. They didn't mind. They didn't really want it. They were just doing me a favour in writing me some letters and hassling a few press officers. And they work in 2 very different ways. The British work on a system where they watch you like a hawk and they look through everything you've shot, whereas the Americans, they look inside your computer, listen to your phone calls, and then they let you do what you like. And they don't really ask to look what you've done at all. I spent 2 weeks embedded with them at Bastion, Leatherneck, and Kandahar Airfield. But I mean, Kandahar Airfield has got a shopping mall. It's got a, what's it called? Thank God it's Friday, TGI Friday. It's got a TGI Friday. It's got a something Hortons. What's the Canadian coffee bar chain? Tim Hortons. It's got a Tim Hortons. It's got lots of little shops where you can buy souvenir carpets. It's got internet cafes. It's got one of those green bean coffee shops. And it's all in a little wooden shopping mall in the square. And in the middle of the square is a ice hockey rink. The Canadians built it. So it's quite a surreal environment. And when I was there, I was saying, can I photograph your sewage plant? And they were like, can you go to a farm? I'm like, no, I don't want to go to a farm. I want to photograph your sewage plant. And they were like, go to a farm. I was like, no, I want to photograph where you burn your trash. I want to photograph where you make your electricity. I want to photograph your postal department. And they were like, go to a farm, go to a farm, go to a farm. And even this last couple of weeks, actually, I've received a kind of spam email from some American officer who is like captain of some infantry division. Hello, we're going to Kunar province in October. We're going to be there for 6 months. Do you want to come? Just like spam email. We're going to be conducting kinetic activities on the Pakistan border. It's almost like they're kind of emailing out just in general to anybody because they know the coverage is going to be so fluffy. Once you get sleeping in those cots with those soldiers, working out with them in their chin, you're not going to criticise them. You're just going to fall in love with Billy Bob and Captain Frank. And all your perspective, and most of it is quite unromantic, but in all of your perspective about what you think about the war, what you think about the period, it just dissolves in front of your eyes. And for me, the hard part always was to remember this. It doesn't matter whether Billy Bob is a mass murderer or Billy Bob's a nice guy. It's immaterial. I'm not there to appraise whether Billy is a nice man or Frank's a nice man. I'm there to talk about what I believe politically about what's happening in the war, keeping that kind of hatred about the thing alive in the face of some people who were perfectly nice people to deal with was quite difficult, really. But as Shakespeare says, I can smile and murder once not smile. It's my talent.
I'm curious as well then about what you choose to photograph. And first, I'll ask two questions. The first is just kind of a throwaway question, which is that you're going there with the New York Times, the New York Times Magazine. And I'm curious if you were instead to go with something like the Sewage Times or one of these totally obscure industrial publications, if you were to have even more access, because they'd say.
My friend had a cover of a magazine called Dialogue on Diarrhea. I was very jealous of it. I always wanted to get a picture.
But would having being a member of that sort of
yeah, you could, but
the Drone Quarterly would perhaps give you even more access than the sort of liberal New York Times.
I'd love to work for Drone Quarterly. If you could get me a read on the rest of the I don't think like my work. The New York Times was nice because it allowed me to kind of stick my nose in anything. If you went to Sewage Times, then you'd have to just photograph the sewage plant and everything. Whereas I could go and photograph the maintenance yards or the post office thing, or where they're going to work out in the gym. So it was wide open enough that I could kind of stick my nose into anything that I could get away with.
Yeah.
And certainly on the British side of things, there was nothing that they didn't let me do. At Camp Leatherneck, I was allowed to wander around, take pictures of anywhere I liked, really. They said, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, that's fine. And the rest of it was all open. At Candor Airfield, they watched me like the wild. So they don't really seem to have any kind of really clear policies about what they want. So Candor, so
Well, I'm also curious then, just to continue what we're talking about here, is the decision of what to photograph. And you were talking a lot about supply chains and warehouses where things are stored, and the million-piece archive and that kind of thing. And your work frequently goes very, very far away from the battlefield and includes things like computer hard drives, and includes maybe even the guys who are listening, or maybe not the guys, but the equipment through which people listen to telephone calls that's thousands of miles away from anything. And I guess I'm curious about two things there then. How far do those supply chains go? And does it become the kind of thing where literally everywhere you go, you find the periphery of a war or the periphery of a battlefield? Or is there a place that seems some sort of untouched or genuinely off the battlefield? And then also is the decision of what to photograph. Is it there's a computer somewhere in Omaha might actually be the hotbed of a conflict in 20 years, as you say, because it's in control of a certain technology that's under development now. And so how do you make these decisions?
In modern technologies, it's almost, in modern economies, it's almost, you almost fall over because the secondary use of all kinds of technologies is, it's quite extraordinary. So, and also coming from a country that has, 2,000 years of military history, that you could just go out and walk out the door and see, the Roman walls that run around the city of London are still lying around, and certainly they still depict the shape of the road pattern of the city of London is something that's drawn by these vestiges of Roman military hardware that are still lying around under the tarmac. And London is not a city which is drawn by modern international finance. It still has a shape of a Roman military fortified structure. You can still see it in the roads. So that idea of, when I came back from Afghanistan, I called that work a chronotopia. It's like a kind of Bakhtin term. Chronos is time and topos is place, and a chronotopia is any place in which you can see that thickness, that layeredness of time sitting on top of each other, each of those historical layers. And invariably what you find is that the interface between those layers is usually formed by some kind of, the destruction layer of some kind of military conflict. It's just like when Heinrich Schliemann dug down on the city of Troy in the 1870s, when he discovered the site of the city of Troy, he found, I think it was 9 of them lying on top of each other. And and each one of them was separated by a char bed, where you can see where the city had been built and then burned, and then on the rubble another city built and another city built. So you end up with this kind of stratified archaeological kind of thing, where these bands of military history lie in the landscape almost, waiting to be geologically excavated. So that idea of that military hardware lying fossilized like in the centre of the heart of the landscape was very interesting. Something much easier to see in Europe than it is in America, but it's not certainly not absent here either.
I'm curious then too, as far as you say, it's so visible when you're in London or you're in a European city, or even we've spoken about German cities after World War II, where the impact of military action is so clear on urban form and on the landscape itself. I guess I'm curious what two things, what you see in the United States that is the equivalent of that for a country that has a very different kind of archaeological record. But then also, what would you want access to, or what projects might be forthcoming that you would try to document that would represent the kind of slow or peripheral militarization of landscape and space within the borders of the United States? And don't say the interstate highways.
Well, I mean, the conflict that I think defines America, which you find so little discussed, is the conflict between white settlers and Native American. And that's the thing that shapes the place. And it's something that's mostly played out through place name rather than anything else. But I mean, what I think is interesting about particularly the names of Native American groups is that if you could exterminate them completely and totally and wipe all memory of them off the map, then it becomes possible 100 years later to reoccupy their names as metaphors for freedom and liberty. So the Winnebago is a tribe that was completely exterminated in the Lake Michigan area. And 100 years later, that name now is vacant to be occupied as a sort of attractive advertising term for a mobile home, with all those metaphors of liberty and freedom and the open road and the rest of it. And you couldn't do that if the term was occupied in an active way by those people. Still, if they still occupied it, you couldn't, in Europe, you couldn't call it a mobile home a Euro-Jew or something, because they still occupy that word. Whereas, Cherokee Jeeps, a Kiowa helicopter, Apache helicopter, what's those red set of boots? All of those Native American terms have been, once you've finished exterminating and completely erasing them off the map politically, then you can move in later on and appropriate the names of their tribes as metaphors for that gunslinging lone American man against the wilderness. It's quite an extraordinary act. So I suppose I did something in America with place names. I don't know how on earth you would photograph that. Not at all. But photographing the unphotographable, that's the thing.
And then also, most of my questions are talking about military action or very, very sort of abstractly using the word conflict, but even just a few photographs that just came by you did some photographs for a piece that was in the New York Times Magazine that was on quote-unquote agro-imperialism, and the idea of buying up huge swaths of land in Africa and turning them into basically productive farmland for the West. So I'm curious then how you would see things that aren't military in any sense at all, but yet are still extremely unjust systems of land acquisition or land use or land occupation, and how those can be documented. And also if you could talk a little bit specifically about that agribusiness story.
The agribusiness story was in Ethiopia. It was to do with large numbers of sovereign wealth funds on the whole. The Saudi government Qatar, South Korea, have decided that rather than investing on sort of slightly flaky futures on whether how much rice would cost or wheat would cost, particularly at the moment where world agricultural land prices are so low, it's far easier to just pile in and buy the land. And so huge chunks of large amount of Madagascar, so like 30% of Madagascar has been sold to the government of South Korea. The government of Saudi Arabia bought very large landholdings in Sudan, southern Sudan. The farm that I photographed in Ethiopia has been purchased by private companies in India that have bought massive landholdings in India, mostly for the production of palm oil. So they were clearing forest where I was. There was going to be one continuous planting of palm oil trees that was 90 kilometres long and 40 kilometres wide. It's a massive production site, and which lies on top of a whole load of other production, particularly European cut flower market is now very dependent on Ethiopian labour, particularly roses. 90% of all the roses that are sold 2 days before Valentine's Day, which is not a good time to grow roses in the UK, early February. So for a long time now they've been flown up. And it's interesting how it's hot from place to place as the labour costs have risen slightly, and therefore this very mobile, very flighty capital is shifted from place to place. So even 5 or 6 years ago I saw it at work in Tanzania, then it was moved to Kenya because it was cheap in Kenya, and now it's been hot and skipped over to Ethiopia. And all of the cut flower production is now being included for the European market. All of your cut flowers come from Colombia. So that was an interesting thing about was the way that entire economies are purchasing other economies as a way of making secure their kind of food supplies chain in a way that they can't do with their technology. You can spend forever trying to throw water on the desert in Saudi Arabia. Might as well just buy Ethiopia, it's a lot cheaper, it's true. So that's just kind of part of a sort of way that the world is really sort of changing in terms of the securitization of food supply, which is very interesting. When people talk about water wars, when a Saudi company buys land in South Sudan, grows wheat, and then imports that back into Saudi Arabia, in effect what they're importing is the water which is embodied in that object, the water that it takes to produce that object. So it is a kind of importation of water. So that was what that project was about, and that idea that I think all the stuff that I'm doing really is a response to photojournalism in some ways, in terms of the sort of blindnesses of photojournalism. That I've got this shtick that the photojournalism, war photography was invented in the 1930s and 1940s around Canada, and hasn't really matured in any way at all since that time. He's still photographing the same kind of things, still fixated on the same kind of things. And the sort of key element is the man with the rifle shooting over men with rifles that you can see. But in terms of the way warfare has been fought, I don't really believe in sort of large warfare, it's not the civil wars and stuff, but I don't really believe that modern warfare has really crucially been fought that way since the end of the Korean War. And if you talk to people that were in Vietnam, the first thing they'll tell you is, I never saw Charlie. I never saw Charlie. I just called down bombs at a certain point in the jungle, or I fired at the elephant ground, but I never saw Charlie. Because that idea of men with guns shooting at men with guns is a sort of myth of the war photographer's imagination. They still photograph it because it's the only thing they can think of photographing. They don't have the imagination to think of anything else to photograph. And so they go off looking for this situation where men with guns are shooting at guns. And if you watch what happened in Afghanistan, certainly the British, they do this thing called advanced contact, where you go forward in an armored vehicle, wait till someone takes a pop at you, back off half a mile and drop a 500-pound bomb on it, and then repeat for a bit like that. But what photojournalism is still on, how do you photograph that distant bomb falling on a thing? Or how do you photograph a predator drone firing a missile in a country that we're not even at war with? How do you photograph a submarine launching a cruise missile during the night at Colonel Gaddafi? How do you photograph someone hacking into Iran's nuclear computers and making them all eat each other? Which is what the Americans and Israelis did 6 months ago. One of these things are inherently unphotographable. And so the war photographers are still fixated on the idea of a man in a trench shooting at a man in the distance. And if you watch closely on the telly, those men in trenches shooting at a distance, they're not doing this. Bang. What they're doing is this. That's just suppressing fire. That's just make all that stuff over there go away. That's not the sound of the way warfare is fought. So, the warfare is becoming increasingly unphotographable, and there's a disconnect between what's appearing in our newspapers to represent war and what's actually going on the battlefield and the way war is being fought. And if we move on to the next generation, the kind of stuff that Noah writes about, where you're talking about robot warfare and unmanned military vehicles on the battlefield itself, as well as those ones in the sky, then it's almost as if the photographers are getting pushed further and further away from what the actual warfare consists of, and yet they're still repeating the same old trope that could have been shot by Robert Capa in 1935. But men with guns shooting at men in the distance with guns. So it's all about trying to kind of break that shibboleth that this is the only way that you photograph war, and trying to break that surfaceness of what war photography is. You can only photograph the surface things, you only photograph things that you can see, and that's what it fixates on. And the whole purpose of the Burke Norfolk project is using history to push through that surfaceness by comparing my work to these pictures from 1878. It's a way of trying to penetrate and pepper through that skin of superficial and surface, which is all the photography can do. It can only photograph the way things live. It cannot photograph the way things are, or the way things are made, or things that motor the way things are. It can only photograph what stuff looks like. And whilst I'm in love with photography and have been for 20 years, I'm also trying to be conscious of its inarticulacy and its innovations.
Well, I think that's a perfect transition actually to talk to Noah in the second half of the evening, and then we're going to come back. I know I have other things I want to follow up on, but yeah, then we'll come back with Simon to hear some more later. So yeah, thank you very much. Come on down. So yeah, thanks again, Simon. So yeah, the second interview tonight is with Noah Shachtman. And Noah, you probably know his work as editor of Danger Room, which is Wired's national security blog. And before that, and actually my first exposure to Noah's work was as the founder of Danger Room, or excuse me, as of Defense Tech, which is a pretty wide-ranging and pretty fascinating blog that was ostensibly about military technology, but found a lot of different inroads and a lot of different narratives and a lot of different ways of covering sort of technology more broadly, but also the incredibly complex marbling between the defense industry and different technological firms and so on and so forth. So yeah, I feel like we can pick up almost exactly where we left off with Simon, and I'd love to know really what it means to cover war as a journalist, because we're making, in two senses, we're making a transition from a photographer to a writer. So I think that's an interesting way of looking at how warfare is covered.
Although I have taken some of those incredibly bad war pictures that Simon talked about. I have definitely taken them in with the gun shooting pictures. I'm definitely guilty of that.
Have you also taken pictures of the drone joystick?
I've definitely done that too. Yep, I've taken two kinds of bad war pictures. I've also done the homoerotic embed. Although I have to say, I was there, one of the embeds I was on was in Helmand Province, which is kind of near Camp Bastion and Leatherneck, and all the shirts were off when Laura Logan was embedded at the same time. She's the rather fetching CBS News reporter, and then all the shirts went back on when it was just me, so not exactly homoerotic.
They were just playing hard to do.
Yeah. So, yeah.
So I'm curious about the act of covering warfare then with, not only textually, but then also where and how it's done.
Mm-hmm.
So in the sense that Simon has a whole series of photographs of just, the hard drives inside of which nuclear bombs are being tested. I'm curious about that range of subjects, and you seem to do a particularly good job editorially and journalistically of covering the different multifaceted views, standpoints of warfare. So I guess I'm just curious about how you do that, and also how war is splintering into this thing where it can be covered as far afield as teenagers with joysticks in Southern California to bearded men with machine guns in the hills.
Yeah, or there's around the corner, there's an NYU, several NYU labs that are funded by DARPA, the Pentagon's far-reaching research agency. Under the Brooklyn Bridge, right where they're building all those new fancy piers, there's a Northrop Grumman office right there. And in fact, a story that I've always wanted to do, and Please Nobody Steal, is like the hidden military-industrial complex that's in New York City, where it's so well hidden, but it's actually kind of everywhere. So how do we cover it? Well, first of all, I think it'd be easy covering military technology and security technology to fall into just covering it from Washington and just playing the kind of like military trade, defense industrial game and covering that beat, and quickly getting divorced from the fact that people are getting blown up, and so it's been important to me to try to go over to these places as often as I can stay married, and if I can't go, then have guys who are either already over there reporting or have some reporters that are over there. So I think that's that part. I think you do have to cover the Pentagon in Washington inside game. I down in D.C. Last week, and I talked to the Air Force chief scientist about how he wants to build a social radar that sees into hearts and minds the way regular radar sees, and the way sonar sees through water. I talked to another guy about another thing I can't talk about just yet, but I will. And then I went to this night vision lab in Roanoke, Virginia, where in sort of on Plantation Drive and just past the Tractor Supply store, there are these two nondescript buildings, and they've got a fence around them, but otherwise you wouldn't know they're anything important. And inside there, for the last half century, is where the military's night vision equipment has been built, and which is arguably one of the, in infantry combat, maybe the West's most important military advantage. And got to see how they're now going to incorporate that night vision look, and then put the predator video right into the guy's eyes, so that you can be creeping around at night, see what the predator's shooting, jump up, ambush somebody, maybe look at a mug shot of them, make sure they got the right guy, take them back to Bastion or Leatherneck or Kandahar Airfield, and the guy is totally in the dark and never knows what he's doing. So I think it's important to cover those, and then also because the action in terms of military research is happening all across the country in far off places like north of Las Vegas, 100 plus miles, or in the Utah desert, or down by El Paso, at West Point. You've got to really jump around all those places as well. I guess that's a really long-winded answer to your question.
No, yeah, it's a good overview.
Yeah.
I'm curious that you mentioned that some of this gets divorced from the idea of people being blown up, but one of the things that's being covered more and more, and that I'm also noticing specifically in your writing, is the focus on what is somewhat unfortunately called cyber warfare, and the idea of I guess you could even just call it infrastructural hacking, or the weaponization of infrastructure. And Simon mentioned the Stuxnet virus or worm, and I'm curious about how you see this frontier of, to use the word again, conflict, where it's not guns, it's not bombs, it's not even drones necessarily, it's literally transforming infrastructure from within into something that can be weaponized, or at the very least sabotaged in a way that halts an entire society or a weapons program. So my question is how you see that as, and the idea of covering electronic communications and hacking and cyber warfare as a kind of frontier of military action.
Right, so the thing that makes it complicated is that it's not just a potential theater of war, but it's also, there's a ton of crime going on all the time, and to me that's actually, like right here, right now, the biggest threat is, losing, the British government estimates UK lost $43 billion to cybercrime last year, so you multiply that out over the world, it's a lot of money. There's a tremendous amount of espionage, both the corporate espionage and good old-fashioned spying going on, and because so much of military know-how is embedded in these private companies, oftentimes corporate espionage and old-school espionage are actually kind of the same thing. And then there's a lot of us that kind of thought that these sort of latest Die Hard movie, you're going to shut down the grid with a couple of with a clever hacker. There's a lot of us that thought that was bullshit. And really actually is not possible. And so the Stuxnet worm kind of showed us to be wrong. And the bitch of it is that now that if we sent it out, that the same techniques that were used, we've got much of the same equipment much of the same style of equipment that the Iranians have, and so that stuff can be turned right back on us. So I guess I didn't answer how we recover it. And the answer is it's really hard. It's technically challenging. There's all kinds of policy stuff which is really hard. And then basically anything the government does, they try to wrap in a layer of secrecy, even if it's the most mundane crap. So, for example, this like sort of 8-year-old worm called agent.btz got into the Pentagon's computers in late 2008, I think it is, and basically became the biggest cyber attack on the Pentagon and the military ever. Yeah, it was in 2008. Today, they're still trying to clean out their computers with this thing. But it might have been accidental, right? Like, it got spread through thumb drives. The guys would just, hey, let me like download some porn from my home computer. Oh, shoot, I need this thumb drive for my classified computer too. Okay, let me put it in here too. Okay, oh, wait, it spreads on the classified network. Okay, let me pull it out. And so, but the worm itself is very mundane. The cleanup process is very mundane. Everything about it. But it was all for a long time very hush hush. It was called Operation Buckshot Yankee, and it was like even saying so last May of 2010, the head of U.S. Strategic Command was at a conference I was at in Omaha, and he sort of uttered the words Operation Buckshot Yankee. And there was kind of like an audible gasp, like, you've given away the secret of, rebooting this computer, reformatting this hard drive? How could you? So it's hard, and there are people, I gotta say, I think there's people at Wired that do it better than me.
Oh, well, you have a really talented staff at Daydream, I think, a lot of this stuff quite well.
Yeah, and it's like the news editor at Wired was for a long time, one of the most famous hackers in the country, Kevin Paulson. So he's both a good BS detector, and it's also kind of intimidating to write about cybersecurity if he's watching it for sure.
This is a bit random, but there's in the same way that marching soldiers will go out of sync when crossing a bridge so as not to destroy the bridge through the synchronous stopping of their boots. There's a I can't remember what book it's in, but I'm pretty positive it was Bruno Latour was saying that if everyone in Paris flushed their toilet at the same time, the hidden vulnerabilities that the sewage system of Paris would explode.
Luckily, no one in Paris flushes their toilets.
Exactly. It's an unbelievably unforeseen event, but it's supposed to be a black swan event. But the reason why I mention that is because of the way that the Stuxnet worked was that it was a specific number of centrifuges in this factory. That if a system that only had something like 91 centrifuges, the Stuxnet wouldn't have had any effect on it. But if it was 92, which was the Iranian system, then the Stuxnet wouldn't come into action. So, in other words, there's a specific either sequence or number, or it's kind of infrastructure waiting to be weaponized by these kinds of systems, which I think is really fascinating. And there's actually an anecdote in Richard Clark's recent book about cyber warfare, where he talks about Cisco routers. And what I think is really interesting is actually whether or not it's a true anecdote, but it's that, if I can retell this accurately in brief, that Cisco routers are being made in Chinese factories, where China was demanding to see proprietary information about how they were manufactured. It was given to them, and then pirated versions of the routers began to appear on the market. And then pirated versions of these routers that were feared to have sort of backdoor sort of coding in them were actually being used in places like the Pentagon. And so the long-winded way of me saying all this is that it's interesting to me that the chink in the armor, the sort of future battlefield, so to speak, is actually something that can be so unbelievably ridiculous that it's just a router sitting on a desk in the Pentagon, but that's the route into a monumental nation-scale sabotage. I think it's fascinating that in that case that you go from these kind of like bomb-riddled landscapes and whatnot to, just a dumb piece of technology like a thumb drive or a router sitting on a desk that is actually the kind of national vulnerability.
Yeah, I mean, remember all the WikiLeaks files were basically dumped onto a DVD marked Lady Gaga, right, by like one kid, all that stuff. So yeah, it can be totally mundane. I mean, here's another mundane thing, right? All the Predator and Reaper, that's the sort of more advanced Predator footage, is all transmitted by a 90s era video compression and transmission technology that's both eminently hackable and I mean, it doesn't even matter if it's hackable or not because they send the footage out unencrypted so that anybody with the proper equipment can actually see it at the time. So even something as simple as like what, it doesn't even have to be material. It could be like what encryption protocol you use, or what waveform you're using in your jammer. Even that can really decide life and death.
Yeah. I'm curious that we're talking a lot about in the evening in general about the design of, say, new weapon systems or new forms of hacking, new forms of offense, I guess you could say. I guess I'm curious about what you see emerging as new forms of defense, and that would be things like covered markets so that they can't be seen from satellite photographs. There's that goofy scene, and I think it's a Ridley Scott movie where they meet Leonardo DiCaprio in the desert, and they circle around him in their SUVs so that there's such a dust cloud the satellite can no longer see what they're doing. I guess I'm curious about what these kind of new evolving forms of defense, things that counteract night vision, things that counteract the kinds of weapons that are being developed, and how those are impacting both the space of the battlefield and the space of the city.
So you see that a lot in Afghanistan right now. Just to take a step back, in Iraq, you had a fairly sophisticated insurgency with a lot of engineers, stuff like that, and so they built pretty sophisticated bombs that could be triggered by everything from your garage door opener to high-end cell phones, which themselves have a form of anti-jamming technology built in as a way to overcome buildings and cannons and things like that. But the U.S. is pretty good at high-tech warfare, right? And so they eventually built jammers to stop those that could stop even the most sophisticated remote signals. It built these hulking armored vehicles that could stop, that could really withstand pretty much the biggest bombs. And they built robots to go disarm the bombs rather than have humans do it. In Afghanistan, on the other hand, since the bombs were made out of metal, old shells, you could use a metal detector to find the bomb even if it was buried. In Afghanistan, on the other hand, the bombs are made of fertilizer and of wood. There's almost no metal in the bombs in, say, Helmand or Kandahar provinces these days, which means metal detectors are useless. They're put in culverts and little footpaths and in farmland, so you can't actually drive any of those hulking armored vehicles to the bombs. Nor can the robots can't handle the rough terrain either, so you can't do that. And rather than monkey around with any kind of remote trigger, they just went old school and they just made it foot detonated, so when you step on it, it blows up. And so those are like unbelievably difficult to detect. And if you pack 50 pounds of fertilizer into a jug, that thing is gonna blow up something serious. And so they're quite deadly, but they've managed to kind of wrap around all tens of billions of dollars worth of U.S. gear and ingenuity with something as simple as wood and fertilizer.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think that some of the spatial legacies of World War II are things like Dragon's Teeth, anti-tank. They're kind of like large concrete, almost like speed bumps for tanks that stop tanks and don't allow you to move. So it's interesting to think that almost like anti-robot landscapes are being developed now, where you can't send your robot into the field to just defuse the bomb because of it.
Right, that is true, and also, in a sense, I don't know this to be true, but my guess is that Osama bin Laden kind of figured he was in a drone-proof compound in Abbottabad because he was deep into Pakistan. Pakistan has a very strong air defense system, and they're naturally going to shoot down anything that comes close to Abbottabad, which is kind of like their West Point. And so I think he figured that predators and reapers weren't going to come by. Now, it turned out the U.S. had another generation of drones that was willing to use to snoop on them and stealthier. But yes, that might be seen as a sort of counter-robot defense as well.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to talk about drones briefly. It came up in Simon's conversation, and also a few years ago when Simon and I spoke. Simon was saying that he wanted to do a series of photographs that would just sort of almost focus on the aesthetics of weaponry. So it would be, a highly polished Predator drone photographed as if it was a kind of Bulgari necklace. This sort of almost fetishization of drone technology. But so the interesting thing about drones is that it inspires, on one, almost like a 15-year-old boy sort of excitement about the unbelievably cool aspect of everybody wants their own unmanned aerial vehicle. Everybody wants their own sort of drone, whatever. It's like the future of pets.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, there's a genuine Terminator-esque fear of what this is unleashing, and there's Peter Singer's work and so on and so forth. And I'm curious then about what it takes to cover drone technology and how it's coming and how to know what might sound like an innocuous form of policing the streets of New York City that could actually turn out to be the sort of totalitarian technology of 2013.
Right.
I'm curious about how that industry is covered and how you feel that you can do it in a sort of ethically non-troublesome way.
Let me get to the ethics last. First, the first thing you got to know about drones is that despite the Terminator fears and despite the fanboy drooling, drones are actually incredibly dumb, like stone cold dumb, and everything that drones currently in the air do has got to be remote controlled by a person. In fact, the biggest problem the Air Force has, the biggest manning problem the Air Force has today is finding the people to operate its unmanned systems. Not just the pilot, but each, I may be getting those numbers wrong, but each orbit, each air patrol of Predators takes something like 200 people to analyze the video from. And that problem's only about to get worse because they're replacing the single camera pod that's in a Predator and a Reaper with something called the Gorgon Stare, which is easily the awesomest name for military equipment ever. And that's a dozen cameras that are actually in a bundle that we'll see over a much wider area. Then they're thinking about replacing that with something called the Argus pod, and that has 96 cameras in it. And so you multiply the video problems by that. So at the moment, the Terminator stuff is actually, that stuff is way down the road. What's not way down the road is the idea that, and Simon touched on this, I want to push it just a little further, is that this is a form of combat in which only one side is threatened, right? And so, I talked to one Reaper pilot, and the first time he dropped a bomb on someone, he then went home and made blueberry pancakes for his daughter because he was on dad duty that morning and his daughter made blueberry pancakes. I talked to a very an Orthodox guy in Israel who had who actually had the insignia of his drone unit stitched on his yarmulke, and he talked about the awful gut-wrenching feeling of those those kids that are on a rooftop right next to a like a Hamas rocket team in Gaza, and do you shoot or don't you shoot? And it's like they've got to make all those ethical calls like that, but at the end of the day, they've got to live with those bad feelings, but there's no harm that's going to come to them. There's no such thing as a fair fight. You can use various techniques to sort of slow down the military machine, but you're not going to actually, hurt the guy operating.
Well, I'm curious in that regard then about drone proliferation and how there was that famous story that's struck hard to the fear of Fox News viewers when a Mexican drone crashed in Texas. and with the terror that the sort of drone invasion had begun on the southern border. But I'm curious about what you are either finding through research and conversations now with people as far as worries about drone proliferation, but then also what is the fear that suddenly we're going to have Al-Qaeda drones flying through the suburbs of New York towards the nuclear power plant, or we're going to have enemy drones flying through London and that kind of thing. I'm curious about what's the status of that.
Well, I mean, I don't know where they're going to fly, but I mean, the idea that America's adversaries are going to have drones, I mean, that's a given, right? I mean, that's 100% going to happen, and I mean, and I don't know if they're going to fly over New York, but they're going to be there, absolutely. The thing is, drones at the moment are really good only if the other country has a pretty fourth-rate military, right? Like if you've got a decent surface-to-air missile system, those Predators fly low, slow, and noisy, right? So, I mean, it seems like this sort of all-powerful, unstoppable generation of military hardware, but that's only because they're being flown in places like Yemen, the wildlands of Pakistan, which aren't really defended by a real military, Iraq, Afghanistan. If these things are flown, if God forbid we ever get into a fight with China or even in Iran, those Predators aren't going to do much good. And so similarly, we don't have that much to worry about right away from the drones are going to attack us. Surveillance, all that stuff, yes.
Can I jump in with a question?
Yes.
Sorry. Over your years of covering this field, I'm curious to hear how the military's understanding of cities has evolved. Everyone is thinking about cities now. More than half the world's population lives in cities, et cetera, et cetera. It seems that they must have put a lot of thought into getting a grip on cities. They run small cities, as Simon pointed out, although those cities don't have women or children in them. But I'd be curious to have that sort of length of perspective on how their thinking has evolved about cities and fighting in them.
Yeah. That's a good question. I think that actually the sort of peak of urban war interest in fetishization happened, sort of when the Iraq War was at its peak, and there was a lot of thought into really splitting Baghdad up into smaller and smaller units that were manageable. Because one of the sort of tenets of counterinsurgency theory is that you first got to sort of get control of entrances and exits before you can really start to clamp down on a place. Now the thinking has gone more towards, how do you control farmland? Is that even possible? And also because Afghanistan, especially rural Afghanistan, is really kind of like a series of compounds, it's like, what do you do with those compounds? If those compounds are booby-trapped, do you go in and remove the bombs, or do you just blow the whole place up? And that's like an active daily conversation that goes on in Afghanistan. For a little while, under General McChrystal, there's a thought of well, don't touch Afghan property, right? That preserving property was just as important as preserving life, because who the hell wants to get their home blown up? But Petraeus was not on that program. And so it's there's a bad guy in there, bad guy in there, blow the place up. So sorry, that's kind of a lousy answer to your question, but that's what I think.
Well, I think it's fascinating actually that, that Afghanistan represents kind of the ruralization of military thinking again.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite interesting. I just have one more question before we can then bring Simon back up and turn it into a dialogue with open questions, which is really just to ask you to put on your kind of futurist cap. And we're talking about the preparation of the battlefield in 20 years and what's to come, and the idea of military futures and what this technology is leading up to. And I guess I'm just curious to hear what you see as maybe the emerging either battlefields in a geographic sense of 2030, 2040. Or even just the techniques of war, if it's going to be Stuxnet versus Stuxnet, if it's going to be drone versus drone. What exactly is on the horizon? Is it cities versus countryside? What are the future conflicts that you see, and what shape will they take?
Wow. I understand for a wired guy, I'm supposed to have all these sort of and also I should have all this futurist stuff, and I should have pithy Gladwellian statements about this stuff. And I kind of don't. I kind of don't. I think that I think people are going to be surprised at how much the Navy plays into this, and shipping plays into this, because the oceans are still wild, and you start messing with shipping, and you're really messing with the world economy, and so I think there's going to be a lot. I don't know. That's just my gut. Is that there's going to be a lot more action on the high seas, and it's also likely where the U.S. and China, if they come to loggerheads, will come to loggerheads at sea, not on land, not in the air, and so that'll be interesting. It'd be cliche to say that the next war is going to be in cyberspace. That cliche could also be true. And then, man, you just got to figure that Africa is continues to be such a basket case, and the ability of and the world is becoming is increasingly unable to roll itself off from that basket case. Especially, I didn't know all that stuff about South Korea and Saudi Arabia buying up large parts of Africa. Talk about a new colonialism, right? And so colonialism breeds conflict ultimately, and so it's hard to imagine the world. The world always wants to stay out of Africa, but that's hard to imagine that actually happening for too much longer. And then just to cover the whole gamut, who knows what the ramifications 5, 10 years, 15, 20 years down the road of the Arab Spring is. I don't. But that seems like powder keg waiting to happen.
Well, cool. Thank you, Noah.
All right.
Yes, Simon, if you want to come up and. You can take this check, and I'm going to both moderate and ask questions. So, from this point on, I'd love to throw it up into the audience, and I can kickstart with an icebreaker kind of question while you guys are getting ready to raise your hands, but feel free to kick in whenever. I guess I'm curious, between the two of you listening to each other talk, about the future of documenting these spaces and these events and these conflicts. And at the moment, Simon, for instance, you're using a camera. Noah, you're for the most part, with the exception of your Robert Capa photographs,
Yeah.
you're a writer. I'm curious if you just see some other form of documenting the battlefield that is either for whether it's non-optical or some other kind of emerging technology of documentation that will either augment your ability to investigate, record, archive, and document spaces of conflict, or will radically even change your ability to be there at all, to do these kinds of things. Whether it's Simon, you, instead of using a camera, you use a series of Gorgon Stair drone airplanes, in your next project. I guess I'm just curious how those things might play out, and if you see a future for documentary action.
Right now, I'm not a reporter, so I don't have to keep up on kind of current events that we know does. So at the moment, I'm much more interested in articulating what we already have and trying to find. I mean, my target audience is to make the public aware and angry about the issues that I'm aware and angry about. So at the moment, the real thing that interests me is using archives and bending it backwards and using those archives to leverage what we have now. And I think so the next project that I do, I'm going to spend a lot more time in military archives and trying to find the history of the development of ideas and not really trying to sort of cast forward. But I'm not a recorder of events. I'm not a reporter on current affairs. I'm an agitator about what is already, I'm a propagandist really. And I'm a kind of agitating about political events that we see around us. So I'm much more interested in sticking my nose in archives, in particularly archives of imperial history, I think. Yeah. I can see myself doing that with the next 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, there's this kind of illusion now that like if you can't Google it, it doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm probably doing my job best when I get beyond what's Googleable, right? And for a little while, in terms of getting in touch with my sources, it was okay, like social networks, like you could just go to the next social network and like you'd have like 3 months where you could have like an unfettered conversation, an unmonitored conversation, because their bosses hadn't figured out what Google Plus was yet, but they've kind of figured that's kind of done. And so actually for me, like the best reporting tool these days is actually just talk face to face, because it's the only one that you can sort of do unmonitored. It would be cliche to also say that there's like a crowdsourcing element that could be done, but I think that cliche is also true. I think there just hasn't been a smart way to kind of like harness the real, to get at the real smart stuff.
Mm.
But I think that is like a solvable problem, and crowdsourcing gets a myth of the wisdom, of like our collective wisdom, but all it's really trying to do is find the one person that's expert in a subject out of the mass, and being able to the software to do that is actually kind of doable. Another interesting thing is like you can get a half decent sports story out of a computer these days, right? So maybe my job's going to be at some point to just do those meetings and feed it all into Johnny Five and let him write the story, and I'll just take meetings all day. It sounds kind of terrible, but
It's worth a try.
yeah.
I was curious with Simon, just on a very practical level, of how many physical places you could find that were similar that were the same versus just analogs when you were sort of working in dialogue with Burke, and looking for, to a large extent there were contemporary analogs, but in how many cases was the landscape, either the same or radically different as well?
Well, I should explain that I didn't. It's not in photography. There's various kinds of rephotography, and the kind of classic example is Mark Kletz's work that was done in the American West, where it really, really exactly in place with the same kind of lenses, same viewpoint, to really re-photograph pictures that were shot in the 1870s. It was very, very weedy and very sort of technical. So I never wanted to start with that kind of thing. I was more interested in just kind of, to be honest, quite loosely vamping on a theme by John Burke, and more just what is it that he would be interested in were he there now? What would he be turning his camera upon? So in particular, I was photographing group portraits of social groups because Burke had a beautiful collection of ethnographic types in Kabul. So he photographed 6 Kabuli policemen, 9 representatives of the sciences, 6 mullahs, this kind of thing. As what what he has there is this beautiful, complete record of a colonial encounter, which is unlike any other on Earth, really. At that time, if you look at the other ways that photography was being used in the Empire, it was a very, very narrow band of photography. But because Burke assumes that he'll get a commission from the British Army, leaves for Afghanistan, and then gets turned down by the Army because he's an Irishman and he's a Catholic, it leaves him free to photograph anything he wants to. And so what we have is not only a brilliant record, but also a brilliantly complete record, which is really unusual. The most tightly, in the landscape in Kabul, there's almost nothing to see. And the only way you could find yourself in the same situations is by using that Google Earth tool where you can fold down the landscape, working out where the crown of peaks is, working out which hill he's on, and then working your way back up the hill until you get the view correct. But everything between me and the far mountain is brand new, pretty much, apart from the river perhaps. So it was more really trying to kind of place a series of peaks in the right place for those kind of things. But the middle part of the work that is most accurately rephotographic is, I think, the group portraiture, where what Burke is photographing is Kabul as a city of Kabulis. Afghanistan is run by Afghans when he's there, apart from the British arriving. But it's a city that's entirely Afghan. If you go to Afghanistan now, all of the decision making is outside of that. It takes place inside the big embassy buildings, and it takes place inside the NGOs and the EU and the World Bank and the rest of it. And Afghans are simply left to receive their instructions each morning, or bicker about what day the bins will come, quite frankly. And the joke about Hamid Karzai, he's the mayor of Kabul, because that's where his power ends. So with these photographs, there's a very, very particular attempt to, this is a picture of the British ambassador, Kevin Yari, with the emir of Afghanistan. And so I made an attempt to make a portrait of the British ambassador with his political staff. Oh, there it is there. Sir William Patey, KCMG, with his political staff and his Nepalese security guards. And interestingly, because of these kind of racist ideas from the 1870s and 80s about how the Nepalese were a martial race, and therefore made good soldiers, it's still something the British Army is still operating inside, in that we're still employing entire regiments of Nepalese soldiers in the British Army, which is this bizarre imperial heading that we're employing these Nepalese mercenaries as British soldiers, and Fijians as well. There's lots of Fijians in the British Army.
Is he wearing white socks or no socks?
What I've done is John, he's wearing blue socks, but I'm using the photography that John Burke does is orthochrome, which means that the picture is only made from the red end of the spectrum. Only red light makes the pictures. And these photographers use that deliberately because it makes any skin with pigment look very black. When you see Burke's pictures of Afghans, they look almost African. Whereas you see this German guy who's a mentor from the police department, if you only make the digital conversions from the red end of the spectrum, you dump all the blue, green, and yellow information, it makes white skin very, very angelic, lit from the inside. And the photographers in the 1880s used this deliberately as a way of putting a gulf between wizened, blackened tribal men and angelic, lily-livered sons of the empire. So that's something that I copied when I did Burke's pictures. It's part of, I'm saying that the stuff with Burke is not just me following his footsteps. It's actually an artistic partnership in every sense of the word, except that he's dead. But apart from that, we get on very well. But I learned a lot in terms of that and those ideas of manipulating the skin tone, because what I want to show is how the power in Kabul has moved entirely in the opposite direction. It's completely in the hands of the internationals.
Is there a name for that technique?
Buggering about in Photoshop.
But for the historic technique, was it?
The old film they used was called orthochrome film.
No, I mean, was the technique of making the dark skin darker and light skin lighter? Was that technical enough that other photographers would talk about it, or?
No, they would know that it did it because they would look at their pictures closely and they would see that blue recorded very pale and red recorded very dark, and they knew that it was a problem. The main problem for most of those photographers is they're trying to photograph scenic pictures, and what you end up is where you have a blue sky with white clouds, you end up with a blank white sky. So any photographers who are trying to photograph the early Victorianists always have this problem of these blank white skies. Some of the oldest pictures, I think one of the most valuable pictures in the world at auction is a picture of a seascape by Gustave Le Gray, and it's a composite negative of a separate sky negative to try and put detail in the sky, because all the skies are always just blank white skies. For example. Burke didn't bother with that because he was more of a kind of themes photographer. So that it's a kind of thing that they were aware of and a tool that they employed. It's something I like of it also, with shades of the O.J. Simpson Time magazine cover as well, all thrown in there too.
Yeah, I guess I just want to ask a question. Makes sense quicker than the way that after these talks and being a little bit familiar with your work and reading you fairly regularly, how do you actually imagine what war is? And I'm trying to figure out like what are the limits of a battlefield? Like when there's something very clearly different as you kind of graphically like this versus some of the things that you're showing. What are the limits of the battlefield? I know that some Seton Hall lawyers put together a study that showed that all the detainees at Guantanamo, none of them were captured on the battlefield. But then you both seem to present different faces of an ecology of sorts, an ecology of war. And I was wondering, where is it? I mean, and is it too easy to just sort of step back and say it's everywhere, or is it? Where is it? You know, what's the geography of war? Speaking as a geographer, what's the geography?
Well, the military don't use the word battlefield, they use the word battle space, which is a much more multi-dimensional thing. It's a cyberspace thing, an outer space thing.
But even battle space is, the way that they articulate it is through either layering the battlefield through complex computer programs or it's placed in some way for them. They're like end users of a narrative. Whereas your work shows sort of the, literally it's a sewer plant, right? I mean, it's the other end user. Right? So how do we place it? How do we, because we could say we're at a war in Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, etc. But it seems to be a place that's far bigger and defies kind of spatial enclosure.
Okay, I could be totally wrong about this, but I think one way to think about it might be the same way you think about like epidemics and disease, and that at any given time there are like hot spots, right? And so at any given time in Afghanistan, most like 90+% of Afghanistan is actually kind of safe. There's just these super hot spots at any one given time that move around, and they can be different month to month, or even throughout the day, or maybe they change year to year. So I think that's one way to think about it, is that we're all sort of like, we're all infected with something at some time, but sometimes like there's like a really virulent outbreak. That's how I put it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And there's a fighting season as well, which is a strange kind of leftover from another area as well.
But and also, I mean, I think that there are ways in which it like back here, on these super bases, it'll kind of like glow hot in those areas for a little while and then move on.
Sorry, not to forego anybody else's sort of comment, but really quickly, like something like Creech, where they're the Air Force base where they're flying the drones from over in the Southwest. It seems like that would be a target, or could be a legitimate military target, although it's in the territory of the United States, right? There's something like that seems sort of materially different than, as you were describing it, like for an Afghan walking down the street, it's war from one side. So how do you do that?
I'm not sure that I'm kind of pinning it down and putting a pin on the map to show where it is as interesting as working out the problems, like for example that you see in Peter Singer's book about where does moral culpability lie. Now, if down the road they're working on night vision models, are they legitimate targets? If a terrorist was to blow up a bomb outside that place, would that be a terror attack or an act of war? And that idea that culpability spins out from these things, I think is more interesting than where exactly is it. The state of Israel, where every single person is a soldier of some sort, and a soldier most of their lives, a little bit. I think it's a month, a year, every year until you're 45. Does that mean that it's impossible to do a terror attack in Israel because everybody is a sort of soldier sort of at some point? Maybe that means that it's not possible to be a terrorist against Israel because everyone's a soldier, therefore it's always acts of war. Clearly not, but there's something very kind of foggy and murky going on there, isn't there? And just like Peter Singer talks about with drone warfare, is about what's the legal and moral liability for these things.
And just to murk it up a little bit more, You sort of talked about, well, you know, the military-industrial complex grinds on and wants to create war in order to build more stuff to supply that war. But, I mean, my experience at least, and you know, maybe I'm just totally compromised, but my experience has been is that the folks in the military-industrial complex are actually some of the most conservative about, small c conservative, about getting into conflicts and launching wars and continuing wars, and that it's actually sort of political outsiders who maybe aren't very connected to conflict themselves that are much more eager to go to war or to continue war, and so that's soup of culpability.
I think that's very interesting, and I think, you know, from the sort of old school, you know, Colonel Buffton Tufton of the British Army, is also what is the idea of heroism in modern military conflict? You know, when the British submarine was involved in firing cruise missiles into Saddam Hussein's palaces, they were 250 feet under the drink in the Red Sea, and the guy leans over, pushes a button, and fires a missile. But when they came back to England, they flew the Jolly Roger, and people turned out, and the fire brigade would fire a mortar in the air, and people cheered as they came back into Portsmouth Sound. What kind of heroism is that? Saddam Hussein hasn't got a navy. So what kind of threat were you under? What kind of threat are you under if you're working at Creech Air Force Base?
Or like McChrystal wanted
Did you get a medal afterwards?
McChrystal wanted to issue medals for courageous restraint.
Yeah, don't,
Right?
yeah.
And yeah, that's what the reaction was. That was the military response.